Good evening. My name is Matt Ford. I'm a staff writer at the New Republic. Welcome to our new event series, TNR Live. In this series, we'll bring the table to the issues that are at the top of the social and political agenda, or should be. Tonight, we'll expand on an article in our July-August issue, Voting at Risk, written by Lee Drutman, who joins us tonight. Along with Lee, we have an impressive group of litigators, advocates, and activists who are currently dedicated their time to ensuring that we will all have equal and safe access to voting, which is especially important for this upcoming November presidential election. Please welcome Lee Drutman, Senior Fellow in the Political Reform Program at the New America Foundation, Deuel Ross, Senior Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Wendy Weiser, Vice President of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center of Justice at the New York University School of Law. Tonight we're going to chat for about 45 to 15 minutes and then open it up to questions from you. If you look at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A tool on your bar. Please feel free to use it to submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'd like to open it up now to the panelists and start first with Lee. Lee, your article dived into sort of the challenges that we're facing and how we got there. With voting rights at issue so much this election, what's sort of the dynamic that led to this?
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt, and it's great to be sharing this virtual stage with so many esteemed, brilliant minds. So the article that I wrote, I was sort of trying to wrestle with a few things. One was a sort of, how did we get to this moment? And the other was basically, how do we get out of this moment? So by this moment, I mean this sense that I think a lot of us feel that we don't know whether we're going to have a legitimate election in 2020. And we don't know, even if we have a legitimate election, whether the losing side will accept it. I mean, we have the President of the United States calling mail-in ballots, which he himself uses, fraud. I mean, it's absolutely insane is the only word for it. And what he's clearly trying to do is he's trying to delegitimate in advance a method of voting because he thinks that he can use it to challenge the election in the same way that he was crying fraud in 2016. And we've kind of had now, I think what I'd say, 2 decades of increasingly contested fights around who gets to vote, what are the rules of voting. And I mean, we've had these fights for almost our entire history in some respects, but the intensity, the litigation, and I'm talking to some folks who've been doing some of this litigation, the deep distrust that the system is just not fair. This has become, I think, an existential threat to our democracy, because I mean, democracy fundamentally depends on having a process that all sides can agree is fair and everybody agrees to abide by the results, and whether you win or lose, you accept a certain legitimacy. And when that goes away, it's very hard to maintain a democracy. I mean, the peaceful transition of power, legitimate, free and fair elections in which everybody can participate, and the rules are don't discriminate against one side or the other. I mean, these are the hallmarks of modern democracy. And in many ways, it's hard to say that we will really have a free and fair election in 2020, given the challenges that are just inevitable in transitioning to a voting by mail system when the resources are not available. I mean, there's a point to a wonderful Brennan Center report that talks about what is needed in terms of resources to make these elections secure, and Congress has allocated way short of what's necessary. So we have election administrators who are expecting to do the impossible. We have a toxic politics in a lot of these purple states over, like, how do we even administer this program? It's something as basic as, prepaying postage so that people can send things back regardless of the resources that they have. Now, I mean, like, you know, these are like, it shouldn't be controversial in a democracy to ensure that everybody votes. It just should not be controversial in the 21st century. And yet it is. And so, you know, the piece, and, you know, it's, there's a lot of history in that piece that I am not going to be able to summarize in 2 or 3 minutes now that I'm already basically having talked for 2 or 3 minutes. But, you know, I think it's really important to understand how we got to this moment. And, you know, a lot of it is a story about how the parties have shifted and how that intersects with our electoral system and our geography. And, you know, it's very dangerous when you have a political party who represents a shrinking share of the electorate and can only win by making it harder for people in the other party to vote. And that's the dangerous moment that we're in.
Deuel, when I've been looking at sort of the state of play for these contests, especially in regards to litigation, you know, we've seen over the past years how litigation is almost an inescapable feature of these systems. States try to make changes, people push back. But it feels like 2020 is different. It feels like we're seeing not only more intense fights, but also, you know, much more complex fights in terms of things that hadn't been necessarily wrestled with before. Can you give us sort of a state of play of what's going on in the courts right now and what the sort of state of voting rights litigation looks like?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So LDF, the organization that I work for, has brought a number of the voting rights challenges in the last 7 years. And I think it's important to sort of give folks context for why things have particularly heated up. I think a lot of people trace what's happened in terms of litigation in the voting context to Bush v. Gore and the election contest there. But certainly with a decision in 2013 by the United States Supreme Court called Shelby County versus Holder, in which the court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which in jurisdictions with a history of discrimination, primarily in the South, but also parts of New York City, California, Michigan, other states that had a history of discrimination, they had to seek what's called pre-clearance, basically pre-approval from the Department of Justice or 3 judges in Washington, D.C., before they could implement any new voting changes. And so since the Supreme Court has essentially invalidated that structure of pre-clearance, over the last 7 years, you've seen states passing laws like voter photo ID laws in places like Texas, where the Brennan Center and LDF litigated, in North Carolina, where the ACLU litigated, and then also things like, you know, the COVID-19 crisis obviously has brought on significant challenges with respect to voting. So normally in a lot of places, particularly in the South, but in other states, there is not a whole lot of absentee voting, but now as people are getting pushed more and more to absentee voting in order to vote safely, that's become even more critical. And so LDF, along with ACLU and other groups, have challenged a number of voting restrictions in states like Alabama, South Carolina. I know the ACLU, I'm sure Dale will speak when he gets here, have brought cases in Minnesota, in Virginia, and other places. But the importance of that is that, you know, often some of these voting restrictions that traditionally are not terribly burdensome, like having a witness sign your absentee ballot, have become much more burdensome for people like our clients who tend to be elderly, tend to live alone, have some of the underlying medical conditions that make it very dangerous for them to leave their house. And then there are other voting restrictions like photo ID requirements in places like Alabama that, you know, frankly, even outside of the COVID-19 crisis, don't make any sense. You know, why have someone mail in a photocopy of the ID if you're never actually going to have a chance to compare the face on the ID to the face on the ballot? And so I think it's important to think about this both in the context of what's happened in litigation in the last 20 years, what's happened with Shelby County in the last 7 years, and how often these voting restrictions are in the South, in places where Black voters are sort of emerging as an important voting bloc, or have been an important voting bloc, or other people of color like Latinx people. So I think all of that context is important to why we are seeing increasing litigation, and certainly why we, with COVID-19, why we've seen so much litigation just in this past several months.
You know, I'm glad you brought up COVID-19 because it's certainly something that has affected all corners of American life, and it seems like the election has been no different. We saw in Wisconsin the other month how it affected the primary there, and I wanted to talk to Wendy and bring her in and sort of get a sense from her about what sort of changes need to be made, what sort of accommodations need to be made to really ensure that we have a free, fair, and legitimate election between now and November.
Well, thank you, Matt. I want to just to bring together these two strands. Heading into the 2020 election, there are two different crises that are colliding and really threatening voting rights. The first, and as Lee started talking about, is, and as Deuel referenced, we have been in the midst of a war on voting rights for actually a decade. It really intensified after the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County decision, where in half the country, voters now heading into 2020 face restrictions, hurdles to voting that were not in place a decade ago, and multiple restrictions that make it harder to vote. That was the reality heading into 2020. At the same time, as increasing efforts by campaigns and private groups to try to attack voters or voting rights. That was before the coronavirus hit. What happened now is the new crisis of the coronavirus, where states are not prepared to run an election in pandemic, is actually having a similar impact in keeping out and making it not only Americans across the board, but disproportionately Black and brown voters, the same voters that have been especially burdened by the attacks on voting rights overall. And so to give a just sort of background, like, I mean, as we've been watching in the primaries unfold, the challenges that we're seeing again and again across the country is we're seeing a dramatic surge in mail and absentee voting. In most of the country, voters have always been, or heading into 2020, we're already allowed to cast a ballot by mail without providing any reason. There's a small number of states where that is not the case, and in some of those, they are not moving to expand that access to voters who are worried about infection of the coronavirus, and those are being litigated. But beyond that, the states aren't actually prepared to handle the deluge of absentee ballot requests that they are getting. And so what we are seeing are delays, voters not getting their ballot requests processed, mail delays, they're not receiving them on time, or they're not receiving them on time to get them to election officials in time to be counted. That's one set of challenges that we're seeing. At the same time, we're seeing polling places being shut down and consolidated across the country. This was already a problem heading into 2020. We saw in Georgia already a third of polling places were shut down in 2018. So we were already seeing this shrinkage, but it's obviously been dramatic in light of COVID-19. States don't have the poll workers or the facilities set up right now to provide enough polling places and safe voting accommodations. And so we are seeing both with the failures in being able to process and deal with all of the absentee balloting and the need for adequate polling places, a perfect storm leading to really long lines, especially concentrated in highly populated areas and cities. And we're seeing again that this is falling disproportionately on voters of color. At the back end, we're also seeing, we're not only seeing delays in counting ballots, but a lot of these mail ballots are not being counted. We saw in New Jersey recently, 1 in 10 of the absentee ballots were tossed out for some reason, like no lack of signature match or some missing information or mistake on the paperwork. This, again, could threaten to disenfranchise large numbers of voters if these rules aren't scrutinized and made fair. And a lot of these problems can be addressed in advance through legislation, and where that doesn't happen, through litigation. And the numbers are actually quite large. The number of voters who submit their ballots on time but aren't received in time for the election officials to count them, in the states that don't count ballots that were cast in a timely manner but weren't received by election officials before the close of election, are in the tens of thousands in each of the jurisdictions. That will be magnified heading into the general election. The number of voters whose ballots are tossed out because of perceived signature mismatches and the racial disparities in those toss-outs are also very significant, and especially in states that don't have processes to ensure that they eliminate bias from the process and that they give voters a notice and opportunity to correct their ballots. So there needs to be a lot of scrutiny also of the rules for counting ballots. One thing that hasn't gotten as much attention, and we have also seen in the primaries, is the dramatic drop in voter registrations. That is another casualty of the coronavirus. All the government offices where people ordinarily get registered, all of the fairs, malls, where voter registration groups operate have been closed. And we've seen significant drops across the country, and they're being increasingly documented. In Kentucky, for example, they had 7,000 people register in February, but only 500 in March, and then it sort of trickled down. So we're seeing a significant shrinkage. That's another area and gap that's going to especially hurt the people who are disproportionately not registered and young voters who are coming of age, and this will be their first federal election. So these are some of the challenges we are already seeing. There's a couple of things that need to be done about it. The first and foremost is there's a problem of resources. Election officials know what they need to do in order to be able to adjust their election infrastructure to be able to handle the kind of election that they are going to have during a pandemic, where people are choosing to vote by mail, where people need to maintain social distancing, but that is not the election that they've prepared for, and it's not the infrastructure that they have, and it costs a lot of money. And as Lee mentions, we have documented what that is, and in 5 states where we looked at, we found that all of the money that Congress allocated for the whole country in the stimulus package wouldn't even cover the costs of the 5 states that we looked at in order to be prepared for the election during the coronavirus. So we need to have a significant infusion of resources if election officials can hope to make the changes that are needed. But a lot of the rules that are unfairly excluding people also need to be scrutinized. And that's what we're talking about, the lawsuits again. You know, as Deuel noted, in most of the country, well, I'll say 25% of Americans voted by mail in the last 3 federal elections. So this is deeply embedded in the American election system, and every state has absentee balloting, but it's lumpy. Some states it's most voters, and in many states it's a small percentage of voters. And in the states where it's a small percentage of voters, it's a dramatic change. But also, people haven't closely scrutinized the fairness of the absentee balloting rules because it's not the principal method of voting, and it's not been a principal source of excluding voters from the count. This year, where most Americans are and have been and are expected to be voting by mail and absentee ballot, suddenly those rules are so much more significant, and barriers that people were willing to overlook or didn't fight about in the past are suddenly absolute barriers to voting. And so we are seeing an explosion of litigation across the country because the principal method of voting is now riddled with obstacles that are unfair and that might exclude people.
Yeah, something that you mentioned is the sort of disproportionate allocation of resources. And I'm hoping to bring Lee back in to talk about how we have a political system where something like that can happen, where we have, you know, networks that of political forces that aren't invested necessarily in ensuring that every American can have access to voting opportunities. How did we get to that situation in the country when, you know, in a lot of other major democracies, we don't necessarily see those same forces? I believe you're on mute, Lee.
Yes, I've been silenced by my own incompetence. No more. I mean, what we have in the U.S. is a very unusual political system in a lot of ways. I mean, we have a 2-party system, which is very unusual among advanced democracies. And you know, one of the challenges in a 2-party system, which is deeply polarized, and in which one party represents a declining share of the electorate, is that that party has a very powerful incentive to prevent the other party from voting because of the zero-sum nature of our elections. If the other party, voters who vote for the other party can't get to the polls or can't register to vote, then well, let's just call it what it is. The Republican Party benefits, but that is a very zero-sum nature to political contestation, and what in most advanced democracies that's not a problem, because in a multi-party system you don't have that same, if I can suppress the other party, then I'm going to win, because there are 3 or 4 other parties. The same way that gerrymandering is a unique U.S. problem, because we're, when you have 2 parties and it's highly polarized and you have single member districts, you can put into a computer a bunch of potential district maps and pick the one out of 10,000 that gives your side the advantage. But that only works with the single districts, with predictable partisan voting, which is something that we have. So, I mean, the article that I wrote ultimately comes to this conclusion that says, look, we've been fighting this, increasingly escalating voting wars, which is a term I borrow from Rick Hasson, who I assume a lot of you know, and who has a fascinating book called Election Meltdown. And, maybe at some point the Democrats will win such a majority as to overwhelm the Republican Party, but by being the rural party, the Republican Party has a tremendous advantage in our system. It has the Senate tremendously overweights rural votes. Even a fair districting system would overweight rural votes, without all the gerrymandering, because Democrats overconcentrate their votes in districts in the city. So there are a lot of ways in which our political system and our political institutions are essentially set up to create these kinds of crises. And I think one challenge is in this moment, should we be thinking a little bigger and broader about what kind of political system we even want to have? It feels like we are stuck in this trench warfare, and maybe we're winning, but it feels like things go back and forth, and so that's ultimately where the article lands, is a call for thinking a little bit broader about a political system that wouldn't have these zero-sum trench warfare dynamics that are just poisoning our entire democracy.
And when you say different ideas, are we thinking things like proportional representation? Are we thinking other sort of reforms? What sort of things would be able to fix something like that?
Well, my view is that we ought to have a system of modest proportional representation. We do what the Irish have done for almost 100 years, which is to have multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, which creates a modest proportional system. Australia has used a similar system for 100 years. I mean, these are similar democracies. They're thriving. They're doing well. So, and this is totally constitutional. We'd have to Congress would have to pass a law. Although some states could do it themselves. But I think it's a high, it's a hard reform to get done, but it solves a bunch of problems in one fell swoop, I think. And it takes us out of this just escalating zero-sum, what I call in my book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, a doom loop. And that's, what we see, this delegitimization of voting by mail is part of this doom loop. I mean, there's no reason why we Trump is a symptom of this doom loop. Every time I think about this, like, my head just explodes that it's 2020 and the president of the United States is saying that voting by mail is fraudulent when he himself votes by mail. I can't wrap my, I'm sorry.
No, I have trouble wrapping my head around it sometimes as well. I want to take this opportunity to introduce Dale Ho. He was able to join us, through some technical issues. He's the director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, and we're glad to have him. And just to bring him into this conversation real quickly, we've talked. So Lee's article talks a lot about sort of power within the Republican Party. If you look at the headlines today, Trump recently managed to get his 200th judge confirmed onto the federal bench. It's a milestone for any president that would be astounding, and certainly for this one, it's one of arguably his most concrete victories to date. Dale, I want to ask you if we've really seen an effect from those appointments on voting rights litigation, not only necessarily at the Supreme Court, but at the lower courts as well.
Thanks for that question, Matt, and thank you so much for having me. And I just apologize to everyone for my technical difficulties getting on today. I would say that we have not yet seen sort of widespread impact from the changing composition of the federal judiciary over the last 3.5 years in the realm of voting rights specifically. Now that may change because a lot of cases have been filed in the last 6 to 12 months. They're moving very quickly through the federal courts and up the chain. A number of those courts, the composition has changed from majority Democratic appointees or an equipoise between the two parties to now majority or even supermajority Republican appointees. I will say that, so far we've had some success even in this new environment. There's one case, for example, in Indiana that we're litigating with Wendy's organization, the Brennan Center, challenging voter purges there. That went up on appeal to the Seventh Circuit in front of a 3-judge panel, 2 of whom were appointed by Trump, and we prevailed in that appeal there. But there are a lot of, I think, very high-profile cases, including one in Florida about reenfranchisement and voting rights for people with past felony convictions. Another case we're litigating as co-counsel with not just the Brennan Center, but also with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's a court that has just switched pretty dramatically in terms of its partisan composition and has a number of Trump-appointed judges, including 2 judges from the Florida Supreme Court. And we'll have to see what happens there.
Well, one of the things that really stands out is that we have actually seen some victories, in the courts throughout this process. And, obviously the Supreme Court had sort of a blow to these with Wisconsin last month, in April, I believe. Deuel, I want to bring you in because you've had some experience with absentee voting in particular. And, as Wendy says, we're running into difficulties in bringing the system up to speed with this. How do we distinguish between cases in which, there are voting difficulties because of the pandemic, things that are sort of, inescapable? How do we distinguish between those and circumstances where we think voting suppression might be a factor?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to disentangle the two. To talk about a recent case that we won in Alabama, we challenged 3 things in that case. One was the requirement that 2 witnesses sign your absentee ballot, which obviously has implications for COVID-19. The second was that you have to have photo ID. You have to submit a copy of your photo ID in order to vote absentee. And the third was that Alabama's Secretary of State prohibits anyone from any local election official from implementing curbside voting, which is, an option that a lot of states use for people who have disabilities, that they can drive up and just go to the, the side of the polling place and vote absentee, even though nothing in Alabama's law prohibits that practice. And so there clearly there's an issue with the witness requirement and the context of COVID-19 and people who live alone or live with only one other person and the burdens around that. But the photo ID law, to talk about, Shelby County again, was passed before Shelby County, but was never submitted for pre-clearance. And there's also evidence in a case that LDF litigated even before COVID-19 that law was passed for discriminatory reasons. The senators who sponsored that law said that they passed it, they wanted to pass it because they wanted to undermine the Black power structure in the state. They had called Black voters illiterates and aborigines just a year before they passed this law when talking about trying to implement other voter suppression activities. So, you know, thinking about, and obviously with the curbside voting ban, that was something that the Secretary of State had stopped even before COVID-19 made it particularly important. It's one of the things that the CDC recommends states implement in light of COVID-19 so that voters don't have to interact so much with other individuals. And so I say that, I point out those sort of three instances in the Alabama case because, you know, some of them obviously are implicated by COVID-19, but some of them are very clearly connected to Alabama's long history of racial discrimination in voting. And I think that's also sort of what you see when you look at the challenges that LDF and other voters are bringing to restrictive absentee voting. And as Wendy said, you know, there are some states like Oregon and California that broadly allow anyone to vote absentee, but then there are a lot of states, many of which are in the South, that limit absentee voting to only people who are over age 65 or have a particular illness at the time that they're trying to vote. And I think that's, even though normally we don't think about that absentee voting context as a form of voter suppression, it certainly is in the context of COVID-19. And it's certainly the fact that these states very clearly limit who can vote absentee, who can has that option, is a product of many of these states being, you know, in the South and having that history of not wanting everyone to vote because it does not benefit, it has not benefited at various times the political parties in power, whether those are Democrats or Republicans. And, you know, just to make a point about that too, LDF is suing and has sued Democrats on this issue, and not all of them have rolled over and said, you know, we're going to relax absentee voting. They very often have fought just as hard as the Republicans. So I won't deny there are partisan dimensions to it, but I would also say that, you know, both parties are not always happy to have everyone vote all the time, particularly when it comes to people of color.
That's pretty troubling to hear, and you know, it makes me wonder what is sort of, you know, now that we've gone through you know, a few months of primaries, not just in general, but also with you know, the pandemic looming over them, we've sort of had almost a trial run for what sort of implications we can expect for November. You know, Wendy, if you had to give a grading on an A to F scale, where would you say, you know, the country came down when it came to running an election in the middle of a pandemic? Are there any states that, you know, fall more on the A spectrum? Are there any states that fall more on the F end of it? What's sort of the grade we get?
Wow, I don't love grading, but I think that the country is, as we've seen from the primary elections, still woefully unprepared to run an election during a pandemic, and especially the states that have not seen a significant proportion of their voters vote absentee. I would probably give us a failing grade, though I have some, with a caveat that while we saw massive failures, especially in the states like that had very long lines like Georgia, even early on in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, DC, Indiana, to name a few. All of the elections have concluded with results that are not being contested and are being accepted as legitimate. And so to, by that measure, which Lee started us off with, so whether or not people trust the outcome and the process to get legitimate results, we've seen some success. That said, many Americans have been left out and left to feel that they don't have faith that the election system is now ready, is counting all of their votes, is fully accessible, and will be. And I am deeply worried that whatever problems we've seen in the primaries are going to be intensely magnified in November unless there are dramatic steps that are taken in the very immediate future. I think primary elections have half or less than half the turnout that we expect to see in November. So when we were seeing 7-hour lines, 5-hour lines, just with a small percentage of the population, and also the percentage of the population that is more frequent voters, and therefore have less trouble at the polls or with the absentee ballots than the general population that votes in the November election. If we don't see dramatic changes, it is going to be significantly magnified. I'd say one of the things that's also disturbing is there are 15 states that as a general matter, don't allow everybody to cast an absentee ballot without an excuse unless they fit into certain categories, as Deuel mentioned. Most of those states in the primary did have some change, whether it be by executive order, by judicial order, or by a decision by Secretary of State to allow everybody to have COVID be a valid excuse that would enable everybody to vote by absentee ballot. In many of those states, they have not made that decision for November. And that's like what Deuel's talking about in Alabama. Everybody got an absentee ballot and an absentee ballot request for their primary election, and now they are withholding it for the general election. And that also raises questions about, whether or not the system and the legislatures and the government officials are trying to make the system accessible to everybody.
It seems like one of the things that's sort of been running through this is the question of legitimacy and whether or not, the system will be stable enough to accept a result, for the people to accept a result from it in November. And Lee, one of the things you touch upon in your article is sort of the person who's really driving this, which is, of course, the president. What sort of effect is he having on the way that Americans are thinking about voting rights and the way that, it's playing out on sort of the macro scale?
I think he is having an incredibly toxic and destructive effect by elevating baseless charges of fraud and illegal voting and undermining confidence in the system. Something that again, I feel like I'm in this mode of like, can this really be happening in 2020 in America? But there was some folks in Michigan got their absentee ballots and burned them had a demonstration of burning them. That's directly a product, I think, of Trump. Now, at the same time, Donald Trump is a creation of a particularly paranoid strand of thinking in the Republican Party that elevated these claims. He wasn't the first person in the Republican Party to make baseless allegations of voter fraud. And it goes back to the early 2000s when these strict voter ID laws started to come on the books. And I think it was Indiana was the first state. And even then there were baseless charges being made about widespread voter fraud that, say in Wisconsin, all the voter purges, so it's not that Trump is unique, but I think, sort of Trump is this sort of acceleration of this destructive nihilism about our voting systems, and a sense that, if you can just say everything is illegitimate, and then you have this scrum, then if nothing matters, if nothing matters, then who's to judge, right? I mean, that's this moment that we're in our politics, in which it feels like nothing can be trusted, and that's part of the goal. And it goes beyond voting. It's to the media. It's to all information. But yeah, he is an incredibly malevolent force, but he's the product of a particular wing of a party that has a very destructive way of thinking about politics.
Yeah, and on sort of the obverse side, we've seen sort of a renewed interest, especially at the sort of top Democratic policy level, not just in sort of stabilizing the electoral system, but also in advancing it in certain ways. And I know that some of the organizations represented here tonight, they've worked on, they've taken part in conversations surrounding some legislation that was passed by the House earlier this year. I think HR 1, HR 4. I was wondering if what sort of impact that would have if we look forward to, once we get through, what's coming later this year, once we look at what could happen in the future, what impact would reforms like that have, and sort of what's contained in them? And I think, Wendy, this was an issue that you're particularly familiar with.
Yeah, so I think that it is absolutely critical that coming out of this crisis, that we don't let this crisis go to waste, that we actually recognize that there are significant deficits right now in our democratic system there, that it's leading to where the people's voices are not being heard, and that we turn that into a reform moment. HR 1 and HR 4 are the culmination of actually many years of work to develop a transformative agenda to make democracy work for the American people. It has HR 1 is a omnibus piece of legislation. It passed the House of Representatives and that would transform the voting system, get rid of vote suppression, and make sure install automatic voter registration, restore voting rights to everybody with past criminal convictions, and put in place a range of other reforms that are needed. It would also, it would reform money in politics and amplify the voices of small donors, so that we would not have a system that is consistently being, where the small donors, ordinary voters are consistently being drowned out by the increasingly concentrated group of people who are funding our elections and controlling the political system. And it would end gerrymandering and put in place ethics reforms. HR 4 would restore the core protections of the Voting Rights Act that Deuel referenced earlier, that the Supreme Court gutted in 2013, and that actually led to this huge new outpouring of vote suppression acts, legislation, and non-legislative acts across the country. And if we could just put these guardrails back in place, this could transform our system and get back on track to being a representative democracy where the people can more consistently make their voices heard and translate those voices into the changes they want to see.
We have a Q&A feature here on Zoom. And so if you are watching and you'd like to add a question to it, please feel free to do so now, or earlier. One question that's already been added that I think it raises some really interesting questions for us now that since we've discussed sort of the political and what sort of electoral forces can do. And it comes from Mort Glassberg, and he asked, what can we as individuals do to ensure that everyone who is eligible has the opportunity to vote? And Deuel, if you'd like to sort of lead us off on that, what can individuals do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that individuals can do, and maybe the one that is the easiest, is what Wendy has suggested, right? Is to support HR 1 and HR 4 to push Congress to pass new legislation that protects the right to vote. That is, sending emails and letters to your Congress people. And that's true whichever, whatever electoral district or state you live in. It's just important to make sure that your voice is heard. And I think the other thing that you can do is, the other thing that you can do in addition to supporting legislation like HR 1 and HR 4 is to get involved in your local community, to get involved in organizations, whether it's national organizations like Brennan Center, LDF, or the ACLU, or local groups like the League of Women Voters that do things like voter registration. Serve, if you're a young person in particular nowadays, serve as a poll worker. A lot of our poll workers, as I think everyone knows, are folks who are elderly. So if you are in your 30s or 40s, volunteering to spend the day being a poll worker is a really great way to protect our democracy. So any of those things, getting involved in the elections at the very local level, are in some ways as or more important than the work that national organizations are doing. You can see that now with obviously the Black Lives Matter movement. Just people out in the street protesting, asking for change, has real results, and obviously helping people in a very individual way is important as well.
And if I could just riff off of Mort's question real quick, you know, the obverse of that is what can Americans do if they feel like their rights are being infringed? And, you know, Dale, I know you've worked on this issue a lot. If one of our, somebody in our audience feels like they're running into difficulties in the system, what recourse do they have as an individual?
Well, there are a few different things. You know, at different stages of the process. I think one of the most critical things that we need to try to do between now and Election Day is help amplify the information that's out there about voting by mail or voting early in person. You know, I talk about this presidential election as maybe being the most challenging from an election administration perspective since the 1864 presidential election was conducted during the Civil War. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. You know, we had 80 million people vote in person on Election Day in 2016. We are likely to have more voters assigned per polling location this November than we've ever had in history because the electorate has grown, but because of things like poll worker shortages, which Deuel referred to, we're going to have fewer polling locations than we typically have in a presidential election. So we're going to have a potentially massive crowding problem during the worst pandemic in a century, right? It's a recipe for a lot of problems, and we've seen that already start to happen during the primaries in places like Atlanta, Las Vegas, Milwaukee. So voting by mail, one potential solution here. As Wendy alluded to, you know, most states do let people vote, every eligible voter vote by mail. The states that don't, most of them have waived that requirement to have a particular excuse, at least during their primaries. Again, remains to be seen if they'll do it in November, but you know, the trajectory there on the rules is good. The problem is that the rules vary from state to state. We have 50 different voting systems. It's hard to make that information clear because you have to target it in ways, and you know, different rules for who's eligible, how you get your absentee ballot, when you have to request it by, when you have to return it by. So we're going to do our part. We're creating a digital tool that's optimized for handheld devices that has all that information on a state-by-state basis. It'll be live by the end of the summer. It'll be updated in real time as those rules change as a result of litigation or executive orders and whatnot. But I think everyone can do their part to try to amplify that information. If people feel like they're not, you know, getting the right to vote by mail that they think they should have, they can come to us to get that information. And then to the extent that people have problems when they actually go to the polls on Election Day or during early voting, I think the best resource to turn to is the Lawyers Committees for Civil Rights Election Protection Program, which I know we and other organizations participate in. There's a toll-free number, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, that you can report problems to. Lawyers from all over the country, both in the civil rights community, the good government community, and in the private sector, volunteer to participate in that program. They take calls, they answer people's questions. If problems are bigger than can be resolved on the phone, they escalate it to the right level to try to get problems fixed. And that is, I think, civil society's #1 protection once the voting starts.
Janet Youngblood has a question that is a little longer, so I'll try to shorten it down a bit, but it touches upon sort of democratic disillusionment and, you know, the feeling that people aren't represented in society. She describes how, you know, gerrymandered districts have played a role, our electoral system is unfair to most people, people can't afford to run for office. Lee, I guess I'll direct it to you if I can, you know, synthesize her question a bit. Do you think we're headed towards a legitimacy crisis for American democracy, or have we already reached it?
For a lot of people, I think we've already reached it. I mean, the number of people who say they are dissatisfied with how democracy works in America is disturbingly high. It's, you know, it's think it's over 50%. The fact that so many people don't vote, even we spent a lot of time talking about the obstacles to people voting, and those are certainly real, but there are a lot of people in this country who do not face those obstacles and still don't vote because they feel like their vote matters. Their vote doesn't matter. And, frankly, I get why a lot of people feel that way, because, for a lot of folks in this country, it doesn't matter who gets elected and who wins, things don't get better for them. And, we touched a little bit on the problems with campaign finance when Wendy was talking about HR 1, which is a very impressive public matching for small donors. But yeah, there is a gauntlet that candidates have to run through in order to get elected. I think that's changing a little bit with small donor financing through the internet, and I think we're seeing more progressive candidates being able to raise money. But still, there's a long way to go there. I mean, my previous book was about the power of corporate lobbying in Washington, D.C., which has had a tremendously distorting effect. So all of these things contribute to a sense that our system is broken. And I've looked at a lot of polling trends on trust in how government works and satisfaction. And in a lot of areas, we are at the lowest level we've ever seen in modern polling, which goes back to the 1940s. And probably the levels of discontent that we have now are on par with what we saw in the run up to the progressive era, which in some ways suggests how bad things are. But in a way, it gives me hope, because I think there is just this widespread sense that our system is really fundamentally broken in a lot of ways. And we're just shining a flashlight in this conversation on one way in which that system is broken. And at some point there has to be a reckoning. And I think a lot of folks are just focused on getting Donald Trump out of the White House so he doesn't do any more damage. But in some ways, I think both Trump's presidency and the fact that he got elected in the first place has woken a lot of people up to the fact that this is not the greatest democracy on earth. By every international ranking of democracy, the U.S. is no longer a full democracy. We are a flawed democracy. We're about at the level of Poland or Greece by a lot of international standards. And so yeah, I think we are. This is one of many reasons why American democracy is in a legitimacy crisis. And I think for all of us, this is really an incredibly important moment, because something new needs to happen, and we can't keep going like we're going. And so ultimately, things feel rough now, but we've made our democracy better numerous times in the past, and I believe we can do it again.
I could just sort of add on one note to that, because I completely agree with Lee's analysis, and there has really been an incredible crisis and lack of confidence in our democracy that's been increasing. But we've seen some now momentum towards reform. Because there's two hopeful points I want to add, is that there actually are real reforms that turn that around and that actually make the democracy more responsive to the will of the people, and they work and they exist and are in place in states and localities and in pieces across the country, both in terms of increasing voter turnout, in terms of increasing representative responsiveness and ending gerrymandering, in terms of ensuring that people's voices aren't drowned out. And there's been a lot of momentum and mobilization around those reforms in recent years. And we saw some huge gains in 2018 in ballot initiatives across the country, where voters voted for reforms that I know the ACLU, Brennan Center worked on as well, but not just to reform the voting system, to end gerrymandering. We saw HR 1 is itself a reflection of a giant demand for reform and a recognition that there are actual real solutions that can bring about those reforms. That was after 100 potential members of Congress ran on reform platforms. And that was in part including many of those who actually won and flipped the House of Representatives. So there is some momentum in favor of reform. And so I just want to say we can turn that tide. We need to keep their foot on the pedal though.
Yeah, and I'd like to just briefly add, I think a lot of what gets discussed is, President Trump, national elections, who controls the Senate, who controls Congress, but really what matters in a lot of people's day-to-day lives a lot more is who is your city councilman, who is your mayor, who is on your county commission. Those are the things that decide a lot of the issues that are being talked about in protests right now, right? Whether police are held accountable or not, whether or not your school is being provided the resources that it deserves. And so I understand the frustration clearly of a lot of voters in thinking about how voting does or does not impact your life. But I think that comes from a misunderstanding of sort of, yes, who is president is important, yes, who your senator is important, but it's, as I said, even more important who your city council person is and who your local prosecutor is. And so I think, one of the piece of this is also just the importance of making sure that people continue to mobilize in elections, continue to be involved in their what's going on, not just at the national level, but at the local level, and understanding that your vote does matter, even if it doesn't seem like it does in a presidential election when you live in a blue or a red state.
I realized a few minutes ago that I forgot to do intros at the beginning of this, like I said I would. And so since we're close to wrapping up here, I wanted to give everybody the opportunity to make sort of a closing statement. And since I didn't give an opportunity for an opening statement at the beginning. So yeah, starting with Lee, if you'd like to give us thoughts. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, and closing thoughts along that line.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to see this conversation end on a hopeful note. And, I've been thinking a lot about the opportunity that this moment presents. I mean, it feels like a transformative moment. And, I think it's remarkable to see the ways in which public attitudes on policing have changed. And I think that, there's a way in which change happens, and it happens slowly and then all at once. And I think we have a moment now in which it's on all of us to really have a vision for what we want our democracy to look like, and what a 21st century democracy should be. And so that's why conversations like this are so important. And it's often we focus on what's gone wrong and what are the problems, but I think that it's important also to keep the positive in mind, which is a democracy in which everybody's vote counts, in which more people feel like they're included, the political system is responsive and legitimate, and reflects reasonable compromises on issues where that reflects some sort of majority opinion. So I have a vision for that. I wrote a book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop: The Case for Multi-Party Democracy, and I really do believe that the two-party system is fundamentally broken, and in order to have a truly fair and representative democracy, we need some form of proportional representation. And that might seem like a radical vision to some, but I think it's the norm among advanced democracies, and it's the natural evolution of our democracy. And so with that, I pass the baton.
Dale?
Thanks for that, Matt. You know, I'll just say kind of on a personal note that I think for every, you know, like for me, like I think for everyone, the last few months have been incredibly challenging, you know, particularly, you know, with my work, I thought we were going to be doing one thing in 2020, thought it was going to be challenging, thought it was going to be hard preparing for this presidential election. And obviously the pandemic has completely scrambled election preparation like it has everything else. And we have this kind of unprecedented challenge that we're facing. I will say, though, that over the last few weeks, as bad as things are and as challenging as they've been, I've been more hopeful than perhaps I think probably at any point than I've been over the last 3.5 years. You know, voting's important. Obviously, we're the first person to say that, but it's not everything. And what we're seeing right now, the tremendous energy from the demonstrations against police violence and in support of Black lives, I feel like are catalyzing something that, you know, I don't know exactly where it's all going to lead, but it makes me hopeful in a way that I haven't felt in a very long time.
Deuel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more to add than what I've already said. That, you know, I think I just encourage people to get involved at all levels of the election process, whether that's helping your neighbor register to vote, volunteering to be a poll worker, getting involved with a national or local organization. And as Dale said, and others have said, you know, I think the time that we're living in right now is full of a lot of peril and a lot of danger, but it's also full of a lot of hope. Just the fact that we're seeing demonstrations about racial justice and civil rights that we haven't seen in the last 50 years. And that has been able to move both policymakers and public opinion so quickly is what's really, I think, inspiring, and it makes me hopeful to continue this work no matter what happens in the courts or in Congress, because ultimately it is up to people acting together, trying to make the world a better place, for better or worse. That is what's going to have an impact and hopefully change things for the better.
Wendy?
So I agree with everything that's been said. We'll bring it back into November. I think that, you know, there are millions of Americans that have been in the streets protesting, demanding justice for Black lives, demanding an end to systematic racism. It will be a real threat to the fairness and legitimacy of the election if many of those Americans who cast ballots or have their ballots count and actually make change in the American way, which is elect representatives that'll bring about the changes that they are seeking. And so it is critical that in order to continue harnessing that energy and to continue the American political experiment, that we ensure that November elections works and that everybody can cast a ballot and have their ballots count as they casted it. So I think I want to sort of turn back to the challenge that we have right now between now and November, making sure that election officials have the resources they need, making sure Congress gives them that money, and making sure that the rules are fair, that there are polling places too, and that so that people can translate whatever political views they have into political change at the polling place.
All right, well, I wanted to thank our panelists tonight, Lee, Deuel, Wendy, Dale, for their time, their thoughts this evening. They've been exceptionally generous in joining us, and I certainly really appreciate it. I also want to thank you, the audience watching at home, for taking the time this evening to join us. I hope you found this as enlightening and as optimistic as I did. And I look forward to seeing you all at the polls in November. Thank you again.